We are very happy to welcome Gouldsboro resident Deborah Priest, who will take us on her personal journey into the salt marshes of Grand Marsh Bay for the archaeological treasures she's found, and to explain to us how important the system was in the 18th and 19th century to Gouldsboro's economy and also to New England in general, the marsh hay harvesting, the marsh hay agricultural movement. So without any more...
Deborah Priest. And tonight you will hear about the intersect of story and history, of people past and present, of sea and land, and what lies between. Now, first a story, personal story. 35 years ago, we bought a piece of land, literally sight unseen for the height and density of the alders that greeted us at the roadside. My husband spent his waning youthful energy clearing out a spot for us, and we began seeing signs of very interesting things, previous human habitation, older habitation, much older. First were the 6 ancient maples in a row that basically greeted us and then died utterly. Then the ruts, Ronald? Ronald carving out our spot, okay. Next. We found wagon ruts on our land that this doesn't do it justice. The rains this year have made the mosses grow so deep. You know, do you think I'd be better if I just talked to you?
Yeah. I think I can do that. Or use the other mic. These are about a foot deep, and you'd notice them if you walked into them. They are wagon size, not car size, and they've been formed over many years. Good. Next. And we had two big foundations. We took this one apart to build our fireplace and do other things, but the nature of the wall told us something, because these are large blocks, and they were 2 walls right next to each other, huge blocks with fill in between, and covered on the top by long lintels, maybe a third to half the size of the table, that only oxen could have dragged. So this helped us understand roughly how old these might be. Next, Ron. Ron then cut his allowed 75-foot corridor towards where we had understood there might be water, and opened up, and we found that we were on Libby Brook, the saltwater portion of Libby Brook, which many of you know as Popeyes, because Popeye was the last to live on our land. So this is Libby Brook at a very low tide. Most people who come into the salt marsh come across our land by riparian right and follow Libby Brook out if they want to hunt, or I guess it's pretty much all you see duck hunters. So I began to wonder who was here before me. And my question broadened when Ron cleared the corridor up there, and we saw that we were on Libby Brook, and that we were now in the marsh. So the question became, why were they here? Why were they in the salt marsh? And that proved to be a real question. Why would people choose to come and live a very long time ago in a salt marsh? Well, Ron, next, some views of what the salt marsh looks like. These cowlicks of grass are going to be what we talk about tonight as the salt hay. Next, Ron. The marsh has a number of ditches going through it through it. Some of them you see, and they're quite deep, 12 feet. Some of them now serve runoff. Some of them are natural. Some were dug by man. Some are covered by grasses, those cowlicks. And you will remember it if you ever walked on the marsh and stepped into one of these. The time I did it, I happened to be wearing high rubber boots, and the crack, thank God, had water in it, which cushioned my fall. And you don't forget that, and you learn how to walk on a marsh. Now, when I was asking these questions, deeds are fairly barren documents. They are tantalizing more than telling. And so to answer my questions, I turned to the Historical Society's resources and its archives, as well as its publication, where I found a lot of helpful information on the settlement of Gouldsboro in the marshes, which you can look at up here at your leisure. I think most of all, my eureka moment came when I was reading the fairly newly published Founders and Followers. And of course, it's about that formalized settlement of Gouldsboro, the attempts to settle. That's not what I was interested in. I was interested in what came before that. And Reverend Joy mentions this when he says, the first people in the area were the Indians and French. So we're skipping on to the second development of the British colonial period. Settlers began to leak into the newly acquired territories in a more or less haphazard way, led by people known as squatters, who were little concerned with the legal title, but primarily with escaping desperation of poverty. And they were the people of English descent, mostly originating in New Hampshire, Western Maine. And he even names Jonathan Tracy and his wife Abigail among the first. And that was exciting to the research I was trying to do, because that gave me a name. But the concept of squatters was what I was hoping for, because there were other people here already when they attempted to do the stages of settlement with the three proprietors, and subsequently when Bingham bought the land and it was developed through General Cobb. But there were already people there. And there's even a map in there that shows when Cobb had the land surveyed and laid out in plots, well, they're all in black. And here and there are white spaces, and those were all the squatters. And there's even mention at one point that under the three proprietors, William Shaw made an effort and settled the rights of the squatters. So they were recognized settlers. Okay, imagine with me these early settlers sailing down a great sea road, desperately looking for a new life, and they come to the Sally Islands, which look like kind of a haven from the ocean they've been on, and they go through the Sallies hoping to find a protected bay, and they get into long Gouldsboro Bay. Well, if those northern winds didn't put them off, they certainly encouraged them to try a little harder. And they get up to the end of Gouldsboro Bay, and they find this opening. And all in this area, the whole bays, they found West Bay, East Bay, Grand Marsh Bay, are lined with marshes. And that's good news for them. I say that the bays were ringed like a necklace with marshes, little ones, big ones. Now, the fertility of marsh grass had been known, and the management of marsh waters had been known in Europe, and you're talking about European settlers. Way back in 1000 when the Dutch, developed water management, and that spread through Europe. So the French, who had great marshes on the west coast, Pitou, and down on their Mediterranean coast, the mouth of the Rhone, they knew this technology, and they managed their marshes. And the French came to Nova Scotia and Acadia, and brought this lore with them. And they found the marshes up on the upper end of Fundy, where even to recent times, the Great Tantamar Marshes had been managed. Also, there were the British who had the fenlands, and they tended to go south, where the British influence was, in the marshes of our southern states. So marshes were understood, and the value of the marshes was understood. Salt grasses of a marsh, and I have some samples here, Spartinas and Juncus, which is really good for cow milk, and a little bit of the hay as it lies down, the kind that makes those cowlets, among others. They were extremely nutritious, more nutritious than what they call English hay. And they understood that salt marsh can produce 10 tons of organic matter per acre per year. And the best wheat fields, the greatest wheat fields of Northern Europe, with much effort, feeding, expense, produced 7. So this was like a free gift right there in the offing. And marshes that are served by the tides are fertilized and cultivated only by the tide. So the marsh looked to them like a gift. Because think for a moment about these early settlers arriving and discovering these marshes. They found something they needed most, pasturage for their animals, and perhaps some hay for the animals right off the top. Because even if they arrived early in the spring, they didn't have time in a year to both clear the land, remove the stumps, plant the land, harvest the food, and have food for them and their animals by winter. But the marshes allowed them to set their animals out for pasturage and maybe actually be able to hay enough to get them through the winter. Now, my farmer tells me that you could possibly do that with 2 acres of marsh, and that wouldn't be generous. People would come out in the spring, you know, they would have, everybody be thin-ribbed, including the oxen, but they survived. They could then plan starting the subsequent year from scratch and getting up on their feet, starting fresh. So this was the first stage of settlement, subsistence, survival, subsistence. Even later settlement under the 3 proprietors and was very difficult because of the Revolutionary War, the British blockading the coast. So at the time Gouldsboro was a 1-item economy, lumber effectively couldn't get to market and people were destitute. Now, I want to take a sidestep for a minute and say how much marsh are we talking about anyways? And I want to assure you that nobody has ever surveyed these marshes. Even the tax man had no idea how much marsh was out there. Past and present, they don't know. I even asked the recent ones if they had a map. I thought, do you have a map of the marshes and how much? And I thought they might, because when you look into the historical records, they'll itemize how they're taxing you. How many pigs, you know, how many sheds, and they would say dike marsh. How much dike marsh did you have in addition to your fields? But they took people's word, and you know what happens when the taxmen come. People say, "Quit, drive the pigs into the woods." So, in all chances, it's not, it's suspicious when you see through different years of tax books the exact same amounts, the figures, they're just carried over. So even records of sales, you know, don't occasion any change in figures. Now, my husband Ron has a gift of measurement, so he carefully did his measurement in math, and he calculated that Grand Marsh Bay probably has about 160 acres. And that up at the other end, which I must say honestly, we have only visited as tourists, we haven't attempted to measure it, but the other end of those marshes, wonderful marshes at the end of West Bay and over, they have 40. So that's about, that's 200 acres of our marshes, just as of the best guesstimate. And when you consider that, if you add up, as I did, from all the tax records over the years, what was consistently being reported, it was about half. And that sounds about right for what you would tell the tax man. After the settlement finally occurred under General Cobb doing, surveying land, developing for Bingham, Cobb tried hard to diversify the economy. He tried bringing in more people from more different trades, so they weren't left in that same position of being a one-item economy and then having it stopped with the lumbering. And so by 1850, there were nearly 70 farmers. Many of them were, many of them were increasing their holdings as they could. One of the most constant buyers of acreage, I remember, was Norman Bridges from Korea. He didn't even live on the marsh. He kept buying up marshland, and he wasn't feeding animals. At this point, hay had become a commodity, and Gouldsboro captains would ship in their built-in-Gouldsboro boats down west to Boston hay for a profit. It became a commodity of value. So this wasn't part of subsistence anymore. This is a staple of economy. And it brought profit to Gouldsboro. And another thing changed in that with the growth in families and community by 1850, the hay harvest became a cooperative effort, not just a desperate survival thing you had to get done before winter. Family members had increased, family members worked together, and neighbors worked together. So you had this large body of people who would be working the marshes. Okay, Ron, let's move on here a little bit. We're looking at some pictures of the marsh, what you would find in the marsh, a salt pond. Okay, next. Ron is standing at a typical dike. You get an idea of the height. We only have pieces of the dike left nowadays because they've been worn by storms. Built by men, worn by storms. Okay, next. And the marsh in itself, I should mention, because when I walked into the doors at the archives, and the curator nailed me. I was barely over the threshold with, what is a salt marsh anyways? How's that different from a freshwater marsh? And the only difference is that the salt marsh is constantly being fed every so many hours by the salt of the ocean in the incoming and outgoing tides. So in the salt marsh, you have relatively few species, because probably less than 10 species, because nothing can survive in the salt. The few that are here have learned how to survive in the salt. So you at most have these soft plants growing at the marsh level. But as you go higher up, away from it, away from the lower marsh, the upper part becomes not quite woody, but a little bit stronger a plant, until you get to shrubs and you actually get to trees. The trees are not part of the marsh. They're definitely in the upland. But all of this, and next Ron, can be influenced by the tide as it comes in. And certain tides, we all know, especially this time of year at the equinox, we're getting good tides, can go pretty darn high, up to the toes of the trees. And for that reason, the issue of water management in the marsh, especially if you're going to hay, was an issue. Okay, next Ron. Okay, we're getting to the part about the haying, the cooperative effort after the 1850s to produce all this hay for profit, and the haying process. And I stop at the snowshoes for oxen. These are marsh shoes that you have to put on your oxen to go out in the marsh to get over some of the cracks. Now, obviously, they're not going to be haying where the cracks are like 12 feet deep and have to get across those. They'll work in portions of the marsh. But the oxen had a knack of walking on the marsh that cows and horses didn't. They tended to break their legs. The oxen had a sense and worked well out in the marsh. It was given their shoes. So what they did was family members and neighbors would line up together, shoulder to shoulder kind of, minding the distance of the scythe, and scythe the marsh hay. Then they would rake it into windrows. Ron, you can show the next one. You can rake it into windrows and let it sit a day or so, and then two men, each carrying an end of two poles, would pick up the hay from those windrows and move it over to the upland part of the marsh where they had driven pieces of pine into the marsh. That looks like a whole bunch. That looks like about 20, 30. And those are staddles. And they would start laying the hay across there, kind of weave it around on the staddles to secure it and pile it. One guy had the job of being on top. And he wasn't always on top. He was down here earlier, and he had to do the weaving. And when they get up towards the top, and they knew they were about there, and they had just one more load of hay, his job was then to weave that top hay like thatch, so that rains would be diverted off the top. And when he was done, he would take a rope, these were tarred ropes, and he would tie a stick to the end and lock it into the hay and let the rope drape. And then he'd do another one. And so he would have two of these sticks, one for the northeast storms and one for the northwest winds, just to keep the hay down. Then someone put a big stick pole up against that haystack for him to get down. He would come down head first, crawling down the pole, and get about halfway, he'd do a flip and he'd land on the ground. They would leave these staddles out on the marsh. I mean, they're up high. They're higher than any tide is expected to be, and they're back on the upland, and they could stay out there in the marsh. August was the good time for haying. The only thing they had to do was get the hay in before the heavy frosts, because if you let the hay dry out too much, that's why they gathered it after a tide and they had let the water out of the marsh. It was moist but not wet, and if you left it too long and it froze, the valuable nutritious juices in the hay would be damaged and you would lose nutritional value. Okay, Ron? So come the other end of the season, it's time to get the hay now in out of the freezing weather, so they would, they had these boats. Is there a second boat there, Ron? Well, let me just show this one first. They're flat bottom and wide of beam, so that you can just pile hay on them. Next one, Ron. This gigantic woolly bear looking thing is a gondolo, as they call them, gondolas, loaded with hay. The boat could then be brought to a wharf or brought over to a wagon that the oxen draw, then reloaded and brought up to the barns for the winter. Now the grasses depended on the tide. Tide was both needed and also sometimes not wanted. So the issue of water management was a skill one of the skills that was passed along. And water could increase the feed value of the hay, but you couldn't have too much, so you had to get rid of excess water from the storm tides. The salt hay farmers managed this water by building the dikes. You saw Ron standing by a dike, and those dikes actually could rim the edges of the marsh to keep storm waters back and out. They would build them of wood and sod and rocks. There are a couple of up in the marsh that you go by on the boat. You can kind of see, look in the end of one that got cut off. And by digging ditches and to lead water back out, and they would use sluice gates on these ditches. And a sluice gate would just be a couple of poles, and then you'd have a gate that in some fashion you would, could attach, and you could have it open or you could have it closed, depending on what you needed, the water to leave or the water to come. Next, Ron. Okay, we'll pause here for a minute. Now, remnants of the features I just mentioned, you're going to see in the following slides. I began with a personal story of coming to the marsh, and so I'm going to end with one. Our neighbor across the bay is Joe Crary. We are each at the very end of Grand Marsh Bay and at the very start of the Grand Marsh. Joe, are you here? Hey, Joe. Joe is out on the marsh in all seasons. He probably knows the marsh better than anyone. And in 2019, Joe spotted, where he had never seen anything but grass dike before, what appeared to be the staves of an old fort. This is a partial stave. They were leaning back about at a 70-degree angle. They were fitted tightly, one next to the other. And so they appeared, when I say fort, you know, they had old forts that were just wooden staves, one after the other. These were fitted very closely together, driven into the mud, and these were clearly man-work, man-hewn wood, with a very nice sharp tips on them. I want to do a disclaimer here. We did not take this from what Joe found. This was a free floater, and we yelped when we saw it because we knew we could bring it to demonstrate. And as I was told by people who know, you don't let this dry out. If it's been in salt water for almost 200 years, you've got to keep it in salt water or it will fall apart. So we wanted to keep it a year through when COVID came and we didn't have the meeting, and we didn't want to lose it, and we thought, what should we do, tie a rope around it and put it down a crack? And we thought, I don't know how good the storms, but you know, what's going to happen to the storms or the ice. And finally Ron came up with the idea of going to one of those high salt ponds on our land and drove it right down into the edge of the salt pond. And then, being in our 70s, we forgot what we did with it. So we spent some time going to the marsh in spring looking for it. And, there, it tells its own story. This will be returned to the marsh, to free flow wherever destiny takes it. And so, we had this feature, and we were just amazed at all the effort that had been put into it. Well, where was the feature? The feature was right at the mouth of the marsh. Right, let's move ahead a bit. We are in the grasses here. Let's go out towards the head of the marsh. Okay, where Grand Marsh Bay ends and the marsh starts, first you get some mud flats with all the birds. And then you get the real start to the marsh itself, its banks with hay. And so what was interesting, you can go to the next, let's see if we get a picture of that. No, oh, that's just the party. Better explain this. Joe had this great idea. He knew there was a state archaeologist over in Blue Hill working. And he contacted him, and in the October of 2019, he got him to come with his assistant and look at some of these artifacts that we were finding. And this is the party gathering on the marsh that October. Okay, next. And we had to wend our way through the marsh with its high open ponds and, you know, walking over very narrow passageways to get over to where this feature was. Nothing is direct on the marsh. You've got to walk around these ditches, and it's very, very circuitous. Okay, next. Yeah, we're approaching the bank. Ron, next. We're having to get around these incredible mud ditches. Next. And here's the archaeologist looking down one of these ditches. This gives you a good idea that at an ultra low tide, which we had chosen, the ditch could be 12, 14 feet deep. That takes some getting around. Next. Next. Nice picture, but let's get over the staves. Keep going. What happened to the staves? Let's go to the staves, Ron.
Next one.
There we go. Seeing the toes of the staves coming out there. The dike faced the length of both West and Grand Marsh Bays, where the storms hit the marsh head on. This is man-made work of about 170 years, attempt to harden the very head of the marsh against the onslaught of storms and the restless winter ice. So Joe contacted the archaeologists. We went out, we all took a look at these staves and agreed, yeah, that looks man-made, okay. Next, Ron. A slightly different view along the edge of it, okay. We kept looking, and this is the fun part. This was the unexpected. The staves opened a door on more. Because in some of these ditches, you found rocks and pieces of wood, fairly large pieces of wood crossing as if a bridge. Why would you put a bridge down, 10 feet low? And keep going. So Joe went down, and he was carving a bit of the wood for the state archaeologist to take back with him to find out what kind of wood is it, and can we date it. And despite all of our efforts, all three of them, the archaeologists never responded back to us. But in talking to local people, we were told that the wood is probably hackmatack. It's going to last. And also you will notice that there's no more hackmatack growing around the edge of the marsh. Next, Ron. So you've got this structure. I mean, rocks don't occur in the marsh. Man brings rocks to the marsh, or I should say oxen bring rocks to the marsh. Keep going. And we're looking down here. Wait, is this the one I want? Oh, this is the one I want. With these pieces of wood, very carefully fitted in down low and across. And here Joe spotted, and I really like this picture, that is a man-made hole, which is very exciting to us to find out there was a purpose to this, and somebody had drilled this. Let's look at one more. I think I got another one coming here. Yeah. All this debris coming out of the mud and rammed into the mud is all we have left now of these sluice gates. And what you had were two, vertical poles of some sort, and then you have horizontal across. You must have some levels of it to support a gate. And you have pieces of the gate that over the years abandoned, have been twisted and taken apart in the storm, but these are artifacts left from the old sluice gates. Next. Okay. We chose to show you a diagram of what a sluice gate could be, since we don't have one intact anymore. They didn't survive, and found one in Quebec, and this would be the Salt Marsh Dike, which they would build, but they would have a way for water to come through the dike, and then they would have a gate, a system where they could either bar the water from entering, or welcome the water entering, or let the water drain. So it was a very important piece of the water management. Okay. So we're fortunate to have kept the marsh intact. These are as intact as we're going to get a history, but we're lucky that we kept our marsh intact. Unlike marshes in states south of here, where they were polluted, used as junkyards, or filled in, today our marsh is a natural resource. We now know it's a nursery of the fisheries. It's a home and host to many species of animals, including migratory, and unique plants. So today we use the marsh to recreate. Now, who knew that our marsh also hid some of our history? Next. Questions?
Was the salt salty to taste?
Yeah, I mean, here.
No, I mean, did the livestock like it even though it was salty?
They did. The salt of our ocean is what,
3.5%.
3.5%, not that high. I mean, it's not like eating a cake of salt. To them, probably it's good for them. Yep.
Did you, are there more dikes like up at the chicken mill if you go up West Bay, and there's a lovely stone wall there?
Yep, exactly.
Is that the same, but
There's
later?
fascinating artifacts left up at the chicken mill end. And that's the part I can't address because we didn't survey it. It would be a great future project. I understand there's pilings from wharves because they could bring ships into there. I mean, that'd be the logical place where you load your hay to, send it, down the coast, up the coast for profit, for sale. I think that, did I hear rumor that sometimes you get interns? That would be a good project for an intern, to actually do a survey.
We are not that fortunate. They have one in Sullivan, but we haven't had any yet.
Yeah.
As they say, we're working on it.
Yeah. Well, if anybody has a young son or daughter who would be interested in taking kayaks and out and actually kind of charting this more, it would be nice to get a handle on that.
It was fascinating.
Yeah. Joe?
I just wanted to point out that these dikes required a massive amount of work. They're all built out of granite. So these dikes are hundreds of feet long. I should know the exact number on our marsh. 7, 8, I'm not sure, 6, I should know, and how to buy them hundreds of times. But they are all built out of granite. And so that's a pretty good indicator of how important this was, because if you think about hauling stone boats full of granite over and over and over and over and over again to build hundreds of feet of dikes, you can see they really wanted to do it, because the amount of labor would have been massive. It's all granite. These dikes are solid granite. They're still there. They're all covered with mud and filled in, but they were built out of granite.
Any other questions?
Well, you're welcome to come up and look at some of these. I mean, many of you I know already know the variety of plants you can get, and that bugs do apparently came. Those that have learned to survive with salt, they're nice succulent. And one of my favorites, I've never quite gotten my courage up to try, but the English claim this is very edible, the glasswort. Try that. Actually take a piece and bite into it. You'll get some salt. Yeah, and I want to add one more thing. I had a thought late. I only was speaking to European settlement and European uses of the marsh. And certainly there was indigenous use of the marsh thousands of years before we got to it. And of course we know they would come in summer to hunt and fish, but they also came to find food and medicines. And I ran down to the marsh this morning just to remind me that this would be so. Some marsh products here. If you've ever ever been in the marsh and you've seen those marsh ponds and how bacteria grow, algae grow, and they fill up and they look really poisonous. But then a big storm comes along and knocks the algae out of the pond, and it lies in the grasses, and it dries. And it dries into this fibrous mat, which is not yucky to touch. You can look at its structure. It can be used for insulation. It could be used in buildings. It could be used in mats. And also, they would come for medicines. They would come for food. The rhizomes of cattails, good food. And the flower of the cattail, when it blows, is down. And they can stuff, you know, the wooden baby packs with the down, and they have multiple uses. So they were clearly using the marshes way before the Europeans came, and that just wasn't the scope. But I didn't want to insult anybody who comes from that tradition. Yep.
When did it end and how?
I'm sorry?
When did it end and use of the market?
Well, industrialism came. You know, the Industrial Revolution even hit here, and it became more mechanized, and then were just, I think, out-competed. To this day, they farm salt hay in New Jersey in such a huge operation. It's a huge operation down there, believe it or not, for landscaping. And other uses we don't really think of nowadays that hay would be put for.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It was fascinating.
Thank you.
We have a certificate for you.
Ooh.